I hear you. I totally get it. It's really difficult to try to balance being up to date, but also not wanting to just fall for whatever fad or trend happens to pop up online. How do you know who's right? How do you figure out who to trust on the internet? It's incredibly frustrating. And you're not going to be perfect. You're going to miss sometimes. My goal here, though, is to help you get a little bit better at that. Science is a great place to start, right? But we know it's flawed and limited. And honestly, it only represents a portion of what people use as evidence when they're making their real-life decisions. So don't worry. I'm not here to teach you how to read research studies or how to interpret forest plots or whatever awfulness that was. Right? But you can't just ditch science either because it's complicated and then turn around and blindly follow whatever guru, coach, or influencer you happen to follow on Instagram. That's a terrible strategy. So what I thought I'd do today is show you some of the tricks people use to sound very convincing when they're actually full of But more importantly, what I really want to get to is my personal approach to how I go through some of these things and to keep my BS detector as sharp as possible. And in case you're wondering, yes, I'm recording this during the quarantine corona thing, so this whole thing, you don't worry about that. You just don't you worry about that. So if that all sounds exciting, I invite you to join me for the next 55 minutes or so, and I'll teach you a little bit more about this bulletproof BS detector that I've developed to help you understand how to navigate this complicated arena we're all living in right now. First thing we have to do is identify what I call your philosophy. And this could be your personal one, and you should develop this, but also the philosophy of the person you're listening to or trying to learn from. Once you understand where they lie on this continuum, then you're a lot less likely to be tricked, right? Because they could be genuinely trying to trick you, or they could not. You just don't understand where they are in terms of how they value evidence. And so I showed this video in the 5-minute clip, but I want to talk a lot more in depth about it now. And if you didn't see the 5-minute one, well, here you go. So on the red side of the spectrum, here's what I call the gurus. And I don't really mean that with a negative connotation. I probably should have chosen a different word. Because they're not necessarily bad people or wrong, right? They just tend to be people who are the early adopters. So they don't require a ton of scientific evidence to do things. And the benefit of that is they're way faster. They tend to be innovative. So they develop and they find things out that scientists would never do. They ignore them. Without this stuff, we would be in big, big, big trouble. The downsides, though, they have an incredibly high error rate. In fact, they're almost always wrong because they're trying to do something new. They're trying to be innovative. They're intentionally going against the grain for the most part. They're often very attention-seeking. They want to be important. They want to look like gurus and experts, and they want to be cutting edge. I mean, think about this. This is what drives half of social media, almost all of media right now. You don't want the person who's going to come. In fact, I'll put it this way. Just about every damn podcast I've ever been on, and I've been on several hundred now, they ask, like, well, what's a new exciting thing? And I'm always like, nothing, man. That's not how science works. If you want to get the new exciting thing, get on, fill in the name there. Like you pick your person who's the hacker or the blog or the person, like they're going to tell you what's innovative. I'm going to tell you, well, it took us 3 or 4 years to figure this little thing out and it helped us learn a little bit better. But that's because I'm a scientist. I am clearly more towards the blue end of the spectrum, which you'll see in a little bit later. And that's not better. It's not worse. I actually fundamentally think we need people on both sides. It's very, very helpful. I know there are plenty of things I have learned from the red end of the spectrum. And a lot of times things that start in the red end up being in the blue. So that's fine. I'm not knocking anyone. You just have to be careful and you have to use your own brain to think about, am I listening to one of these people who's red? They don't really care about being wrong necessarily. In fact, they're often wrong and they don't apologize. They want to just do the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And they don't ever come back and be like, oh, that thing I was super into last year, it turns out I don't buy it anymore, or I don't believe in it. They just do next. And so you need to, in your mind, go, okay, grain of salt here. They tend to want to have a lot of attention. They tend to like to be popular and want to be viewed of as that, oh, he's so innovative or she's so advanced. Maybe not, right? You're going to have a high error rate. What's that saying about being on the end of a blade or being cutting edge all the time? You're going to get cut a lot, right? So if you don't care about that, be cutting edge. Just make sure that you're being honest with your audience, especially if you're the person in the back of the camera, right? The other end of the spectrum is the scientist, and that's not a fair And that's a negative connotation as well, right? They're not bad people, they're not wrong, and they're not just literally the polar opposite of the gurus, but they tend to be wrong also. We have ample examples of science being wrong, and sometimes because the folks in the red pushed so hard that the scientists had to acquiesce, right? But they're wrong a lot less often because they're not because they're smarter, but just because they're more conservative. And if we think about this, this is probably exactly what we want our World Health Organization, our national guidelines. We don't want them to be changing every month, every 6 weeks, every thing, right? Because number one, it'd be really, really ridiculous to follow, and it'd be impossible to execute. So we want them to be a lot slower. We want them to be more conservative. Downside, they tend to be very stubborn, and they tend to be very protective of their prestige. So they don't want, they spent 15 years in college and 6 years as a postdoc, and they finally, after 5 years of research in their own lab, develop some pedigree, and they don't want someone who doesn't have a degree, spent 6 weeks trying to put coffee in their nose, and all of a sudden that person gets all the likes on Instagram and gets all the interviews. And so that's understandable, but it's also a negative thing, right? They can hold on to their position and do anything they can to show that their belief or their approach is not wrong. And so there can be issues there. Now, me personally, like I said, I'm probably somewhere in the neighborhood here. I am actually intentionally not an early adopter to almost anything. I don't like it philosophically for what I do personally in my practice as a scientist, educator, and working with the athletes I like to do. But there's plenty of times that I've, like I said, used things from the red and moved me there. So I'm not fully blue either. I personally believe most of us should be more in this purple end, right? Have some blue folks, have some red folks, but most of us a little bit purple. If you want to be closer towards the middle or closer toward the redder end of the purple, that's fine, up to you, I don't care. Again, I'm really asking that you think about this as your own personal exercise, and then really think about this from the people you're learning from. And this will tell you a lot about how they're approaching the evidence, and it'll make it so much easier for you to understand when you're seeing BS or not, right? In addition, just be clear with your audience where you're at in the spectrum, all right? Now, once you do that, then you can implement this BS detector that I've developed for you. And so we can take a look at that right now. Effectively, what you're trying to do is figure out uncertainty. So a major mistake folks make is they want to know what's right or wrong. And that's very, very rarely the case. In fact, it only happens at the very ends of the spectrum. What you really want to do is figure out how certain versus uncertain is this specific topic. So if something is so certain that you would say it's as certain as 1 + 1 = 2. To me, that goes on the green end of the spectrum, right? And there are honestly fairly few things in our field that are that certain. If something is so uncertain like the Earth is flat, you probably go to the other end of the spectrum, right? But honestly, these things aren't that hard to tell. No one has problems with figuring out, okay, the Earth is not flat, or yeah, 1 + 1 = 2. It's the stuff in the yellow that's the issue. And so that's why I've really developed this system. Or at least I'll put it into a video for you, a very lengthy video, is to help you figure out, okay, well, how do I figure out what's a 5 out of 100 versus a 95 out of 100? And what I mean by that is this 10-point system I've created. And so I tend to view all the evidence, and I'm using that in quotations, and I put it into 10 categories. Each category gets a score of 1 to 10 based on the strength of the evidence, so 10 times 10 gives you 100. So if something scores a 95 out of 100, it's very close to green. I would probably call it, I can't guarantee you it's right, but it's as close as really humans could ever get to being right. So that's 100% true. The flat Earth would be the exact opposite, right? I'll give it maybe 2 out of 100. So it's not a 0, but it's about as close to 0 as you get. I'm not interested in evidence for either one. To be honest, if something's 95 out of 100, I don't even look at any more evidence. It would take extraordinary evidence to come in that for me to move it into the I don't do this anymore thing, right? And so really I don't pay attention to things that are like 90% or higher. And I don't pay attention to things that are 10% or lower. Because the likelihood of you just wasting your time is so incredibly high. Yeah, you might miss 1 or 2 things, but really the chances of something going from a 3 out of 100 to a 90 out of 100 are so unbelievably small, you'd waste your whole life doing that, and maybe that happens once or twice. So my philosophy, because you saw my philosophy, right? I'm more towards the blue. I'm more conservative. I tend to go, all right, y'all play with that stuff, and if something changes, let me know. But for the most part, you're going to waste your lives and a ton of time chasing stuff that really isn't true. and I'll wait till something lands closer to that 40 to 50, and then I'll watch it. And if that starts moving to 50, 60, then I'll want to probably start paying attention to it or even start doing it. Hopefully the system is making sense now, right? So we take that 1 out of 10 and we make these mental spider plots. Now, I don't literally do this. I don't have a spreadsheet and I don't have scores. And this is all mental, right? And I'm trying to take now, okay, all right, looks like the evidence is maybe like 5, 10, not watching it. 20, 30, okay, I'm watching it from the side. Oh, went from 20, 30 to 5, okay, it's out. You get the idea here, right? You can imagine scenarios, and I'm just watching to see how things progress typically. Now, we'll get into more of the details later, but not every single thing will have necessarily a score of 100 to 0 to 100 that means higher score is better. So there are plenty of examples that I will show you where 20 out of 100 is all I need to be 100% confident in it. I don't need any more evidence there. I'm going to go ahead and take action. There are plenty of times when something is an 80 out of 100 and I still don't do it. Right? I want that confidence level to be higher. And so you really have to think about the question and think about your philosophy. Where are you at in the spectrum? How high do you need to see this needle move before you start to take action or you believe in something? All right? And so all I really ask is not that you don't do things that are 10 out of 100. I don't really give a shit what you do. Do everything that's 0 of 100. Go to your deathbed thinking the earth is flat. I really don't care. All I ask is that the strength of your conviction equals the strength of the evidence. So if you're like, hey man, I totally believe the earth is flat. Oh really, where's the evidence? Oh no, the evidence, there is no evidence, but I feel it. I don't even care. It's when you misrepresent the science or the depth or the quality of the science that people get really mad. So if you're proposing something that it has a score of 20 out of 100, and it should really have 80 or higher before you take action, but you state that, hey look, there's not good evidence here, but I'm doing it for these reasons, totally fine, right? Just make sure it roughly matches the strength of the evidence. Where people trick you, and this is kind of what I'm getting at, is the following 3 ways. Number 1, they could just make things up. I don't really want to talk about that here though. That's not the confusing part. People can just make up things and lie, and hopefully we'll eventually figure it out. Where people trick you is number 2 and 3. So number 2, they don't divulge their place in the spectrum like we just talked about, right? There's a difference between the evidence and your opinion, and both are appropriate. I'm thinking of coaches, things like that, where their opinion, their expertise is more important than the quote-unquote evidence. All right, and so again, no problems either one. Just make sure you're being very clear or not misleading. Which goes into number 3, which is the conviction doesn't match the strength of the evidence. And this is either because of or fosters zealotry and ideologues. And so this is the classic example of, wow, it worked for me, therefore it must be true for all of humanity. Oh, there's no evidence, or there's evidence that shows the contrary, but I don't care, it's my identity. We have huge problems with this in the nutrition space, and I'll show you some things that stand out in that later, but like if your name on your social media profile is the nutrition style you like, I find it very hard to believe that you're going to listen to any new change in evidence. You're an ideologue. It's too ingrained in your personal self to make a change. It's generally not a good thing. All right, so we want to be really careful, especially when the strength of the evidence is minimal. All right, that we aren't all of a sudden, because it worked for me, because I like it, because it fits my personal philosophy on the world or life or other things or my religion, that therefore I'm 100% convinced it's true, despite the evidence being 30 out of 100. Right? So we just can't have that mismatch. Along the case, what we tend to see here, when people write books or do the worst thing ever, documentaries, podcasts, etc., is they misrepresent the well-roundedness of the evidence, and or they cherry pick. And so they'll maybe go into one of the 10 categories and just hammer you with the evidence there, and don't reveal the fact that, oh yeah, all the evidence in all the other 9 categories shows this is a terrible idea. And so you're like, wow, I guess there is a lot of evidence there. But there really isn't. There's just a bunch of evidence. It's a classic example of, imagine if I did this. Right? You're like, wow, 3 out of 3, this is perfect. But I'm like, actually, there's 6 things here. I just didn't show you these 3, and all 3 of these actually say these are all wrong. In fact, it gets even worse because there's actually 100 behind you. You're not saying, I'm just showing you the 3 representative ones, right? And so that's not really showing the fair breadth of the evidence. And this is why people like me will classically say things like this. Ready? Ready for this cliche term you've heard? You have to look at the entire evidence. base. You can't just pick what the experts are saying. You can't just pick the pre and post pictures. If there's no other evidence to go from, fine, take what evidence you have. But when there's other evidence, you have to represent all of it. And that is going to give the viewer the most well-rounded understanding of what the information really looks like. And that's what we're after, right? So a couple of notes before we jump into this more specifically. All 10 of these major categories, these types of evidence that I'm going to be talking about, right? I'll go through each one individually and give examples. But all 10 have major limitations and weaknesses. I am not the science guy saying, well, the meta-analysis is the best. No. Every aspect of science, every type of study, every type of evidence you could ever get has huge limitations and weaknesses. You can't get around them. There are biases that are subconscious, that are completely intentional, and there are charlatans that exist in all 10. So there are scientists that make up science. There are scientists that don't make it up, but they have an unintentional bias. There are coaches, practitioners, and salesmen, and supplement industry folks that just make it goes across the whole board, right? And so that's always in it, but I don't want to talk about it more today because it doesn't really help what we're trying to get after. Right? All of them can be faked. The reason, in fact, I'm going to present to you this lengthy system, the system's actually pretty short, but this lengthy discussion, is because when you have multiple types of evidence that you use, you're less likely to be tricked. If all you pay attention to are systematic reviews, if a scientist came along and faked one of those, then you're screwed. If all you paid attention to was bloggers and hackers and people with big followings and people that have been on popular podcasts, but, well, when we expose those folks as being liars as well, which many of them are, then you're screwed and you look and you feel like you got fooled again. And so when you take all of it into consideration, though, you're less likely because those red herrings will stand out, right? Those sore thumbs, you're like, wow, the intervention studies, the chronic studies, the acute studies all show this thing doesn't work, but yet you're over here on Instagram ad hawking it like it does great. Something isn't lining up there. And then you can investigate further or wait for more evidence. I don't know who's right or wrong, but you probably should go, I used to really think this thing works, but it looks like all the studies are showing it doesn't. I'm going to still use it, but I'm just going to back down my confidence quite a bit. It's actually really hard to judge scientific quality. So this is why I'm not teaching you how to read research methodologies, etc., without extensive training. I see people do this online all the time, and it always makes me shake my head. Unless you have a lot of training, probably a PhD level or higher, you probably shouldn't try to judge science quality because you really don't know what you're doing. We see this all the time, and it's kind of laughable. So honestly, for the most part, don't spend a lot of time here. Third point here. Not all 10 are warranted or possible. You have to think about the question. I've alluded to this already in the previous, or so far as we've gone along, but the classic example is this, right? So you don't need a meta-analysis, you don't need a systematic review, you don't need molecular research on on the mechanisms to understand that you should not jump out of an airplane without a parachute. So in fact, if I use the system I'm about to show you, the whole idea of jumping out of a plane without a parachute would probably only get about a 20 out of 100 in terms of evidence. But you don't need it. You don't need to understand. None of that stuff is needed. And so like I said, not all 10 levels of evidence are warranted or possible. There's a lot of things and decisions you're going to have to make in your life and your coaching life where you can say, hey, there is no research on this. And that's fine. That doesn't mean it's bad or it's against the evidence base. There is no evidence base to use. And so I would really, really, really encourage you to think about the question. Does the question need intervention science? Yes, it does. Okay, is there intervention science? No, there isn't. Okay, then I'll go to something else. Maybe I'll go with the molecular stuff. It's not as good, but that's the best I have. Or does the question need teleological sense? Yes, it does. Okay, the teleology says that this thing doesn't work. Okay, you get the idea. Could be a whole spectrum of things. No, it doesn't need these things, so I don't care what the mechanisms are. So not all 10 categories are possible or even necessary. All 10 should not be given equal or even weight. Again, you have to think about the question, that tag thing. So depending on the question, the molecular data may be a ton of it, but it may not be important at all. All you may really care about are what all the experts are saying. All right, what are the people that actually use it? How does that actually matter? And we see that happen constantly. We see misrepresentation or over-exaggeration, or overhyping of molecular or acute data, when we get to the chronic or long-term, it doesn't matter at all, right? And so not all necessarily have equal weight. So an 8 out of 10 in one category may not be as important as an 8 out of 10 in another category. You have to think about the question. So an example could be this. So let's say you were trying to look at some medical question, right? And you wanted to know what surgery method is the best, or what to give somebody, or how an ER doctor should operate. In this particular case, you'd care about the meta-analyses, right? You probably care about what are the molecular mechanisms of this drug or this treatment, etc. What are the other doctors that have been using it? What are they saying? What are the clinical trials looking like? But you don't give a shit about your intuition. You don't have any intuition about what drug to take for your infection. You don't have any clue. You don't care if it's natural or not. Basically, every medical procedure is non-natural. So, well, was that something that we've evolved? Who cares? No, we're definitely not. So that's not a knock against what you're doing. This is not relevant to the question, right? And depending on what you're going after, teleological may make sense, chronic may or may not make sense. So you may come out and say these things don't make sense. When it comes to like a lifestyle question, it tends to be pretty opposite. So in this particular case, you may or may not care about like the results of a meta-analysis, because with a lot of our lifestyle stuff, there are no meta-analyses. So it doesn't matter, right? So there's nothing to draw from. But in this case, you will care a lot about the anecdote. You will care a lot about teleology and nature, right? In fact, nature is a very, very, very high watermark for me when it comes to lifestyle things, because if we weren't naturally meant to do it, I don't really care if there's molecular evidence. It's, teleology is probably more important. Natural is more important here. I don't care if there's an acute response if we're not seeing it long term, etc., right? Not all that made sense. Maybe the examples we go to later will, but hopefully that helps you understand. Again, there's not equal weight in every category. Think about the question and which type of evidence would be necessary and needed for it. So a couple last little notes here before we actually start going through some examples. Again, this an example I could give you, that exercise is good for your health, probably has like a 93 out of 100 score. So I'm not thinking about it. I don't care if a new study comes out and shows, oh, it didn't improve lipid. I don't care. A lot of information would have to come out to really reduce that score to a level where I start to question whether or not exercise is good for your health, because it makes sense on basically every level of evidence, right? And finally, being wrong is totally okay. Again, I've been wrong plenty of times. I will continue to be wrong. Just don't misrepresent your evidence. So now what I want to do is I want to go through these 10 categories of evidence one by one, so you can learn a little bit more about them, because the titles are a little bit deceiving. No, they're not deceiving, there's more to them than that. All right, so our first category is what I call the meta-analyses. Now, I don't literally just mean meta-analyses. These could be anything like a systematic review, position stand. So major organizations like the NSCA, ISSN, World Health Organization, etc. They tend to come out with every year, 6 months, 5 years, whatever, position stands where they say, hey, all of the scientists on our team generally feel this. The ISSN is particularly good at this. So is NSCA, by the way. Fantastic of going through all the research in an area and then saying, okay, this is what we collectively think is pretty important. And so all of the things in the meta-analysis category, what they generally mean are they take huge chunks of information, huge amounts of authors, hundreds of studies together, or dozens of studies, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people involved. And they put them together and they summarize the research there. And so they have a pretty good power there. Now, I don't necessarily think these have to be peer-reviewed research. It could be giant databases. So if a company, or like all the data on strength training from Russia, they had thousands, hundreds of thousands of repetitions logged over decades of training. These are not all equal levels of evidence, but to me, they're all important, right? So it doesn't have to just be peer-reviewed, and I throw these all into the like meta-analyses categories. So in general, the strengths of these is they are typically viewed as kind of like the strongest, highest level of science, because the data points are so numerous, and you really get a feel for what's actually happening. And they're fantastic for large population best practice prescriptions. So if you want to know what's the optimal repetition range for hypertrophy, we're going to throw all these studies together and say, hey, look, in general, what we're typically finding is this. So best practice says stay within this range. or whatever the case may be. Eat this much protein, or whatever else is important for a supplement. And so some fantastic examples of proper interpretations of these things. I talked about the rep range one. Some of the initial research on figuring out smoking was bad. The meta-analyses started coming out and we're like, geez, it's really bad. Right? The science got really strong there. Decades ago, you can thank Avery Feigenbaum for this stuff, but we wanted to know, is strength training actually bad for kids? And the meta-analyses are incredibly clear that it's not. In fact, it's generally very, very good and positive for children. People often claimed about, obesity makes you fat, or fruit makes you fat, etc. And the meta-analyses in this show very clearly fruit doesn't make people obese. In fact, it generally helps reduce body weight and improve body composition. Whole fruit consumption, whole fresh fruit consumption. So there's things like that. These were all different things that people use. They use appropriate interpretations, meta-analyses, and they have pretty high certainty levels because of that. The downside of these categories, they completely eliminate context and nuance, right? So they are the antithesis of individual coaching. You can't just take somebody and all of a sudden say, okay, because a meta-analysis said this, therefore, all kids should lift as heavy as possible. Not at all what it says. We're just saying as a best practice in general, strength training is safe for kids. Does that mean every single kid who strength trains is going to be fine? No. And so meta-analysis does the exact opposite of allow individual and precision coaching. Because they say, okay, take all these studies that were done on old people and young people and healthy ones and not, let's throw them all together and see what generally happens. So by definition, you're eliminating context and nuance. The ability to judge the science, the quality of it, like I said, you probably need to be a scientist to get through that, so don't worry about that too much. But another downside is if you got crap data in, you're going to get crap data out. So I do see a lot of meta-analyses and position science and stuff where you're like, wow, there was not enough evidence for you to do a meta-analysis. How did this get through peer review? But it does. So low quality studies into a meta-analysis is going to have a low quality meta-analysis. And the biggest con is they're incredibly slow. You're probably looking at least a decade for a meta-analysis to come out on a topic, if not 2 or 3. So very slow. However, good sources to find them. PubMed is fantastic. Google Scholar can get them. If you've ever been on Google Scholar or PubMed and you found an article and it's behind a paywall, you can also try the third option I have there, which is ResearchGate. A lot of times they're up there and free. There are several companies now, at least in the sports science community, that are doing these scientific reviews. So these are 2 to 5 people with PhDs or something like that, and they go through the science and they come up with their kind of own meta-analysis. They're not published, but they usually have these on low price subscription models, $5, $10, $15 a month, things like that, and they kind of review the science for you. And those are really helpful and generally high quality. Or you can go to websites like exam.com if you want to look up nutrition information. So good places to get them there. The next category are what I call chronic. Now these are not the same. If you're a scientist, you're like, oh, these are not chronic studies. I know. Not what I'm talking about here. But in this category, these tend to be, for me, long-term chronic stuff. So this could be things like epidemiology, could be like 5, or in the case of like a study I did on lifelong exercisers about a decade ago, technically the groups we were comparing had 50 to 60 years of exercise history. We did one on twins a couple of years ago and 35 plus years of difference. So I'm not talking about like an 8-week strength training study. I'm talking like huge databases of stuff. Again, it could be a database from a private company or a coaching platform or something like that. You're going to find these in pretty much the same spots that you're going to find the meta-analyses because these generally tend to be sciencey things. They are strong science, not typically viewed as high of science as a meta-analysis, but the nice part about these is they show the clinical important effect. So what I mean by this, and we'll see this when we get to the molecular stuff later, is the end markers for epidemiology in these long studies tend to be things like who lived longer, or who got stronger, who had less pain. And so the outcome measures you're looking for are what we call, again, clinically important. So you're going to feel a difference. You're going to notice a difference. This is actually something that a real human would care about. And that's really, really important because not all science can do that. And they're also great for what we call canary finders. So epidemiology gets a bad rap, but like any piece of evidence, there are strengths and weaknesses, right? how epidemiology specifically is supposed to work is they're supposed to find canaries. And so good examples of this were things like HPV. So we figured out the cure for HPV because of epidemiology. Lots of kidney disease and renal failures have been found the same thing. It's like we do epidemiology, we see, wow, all these people in this population have this issue. Then we dive deeper. That is how epidemiology is supposed to work. It is not the answer itself, because the downside of it is it only shows you correlation. It rarely can show you causation. So because of that, this chronic type of evidence tends to show you tons of what we call spurious correlations. If you're not familiar with that term, Google that. There's a website. It's hilarious. It just shows you all kinds of funny, spurious correlations, right? And so the example of HPV, we started seeing correlations between X and people who are getting HPV. Then you started looking and doing further research, doing intervention research in these lower levels, and started to realize, yes, this was causing that. So the benefit is we can look at huge databases and find major trends. We can find these canaries in the coal mine. Downside is it doesn't show us cause, almost ever. VO2 max mortality was another one, right? This is when we started to notice, wow, we put 80,000, 70,000 people in these databases. We start to figure out the people with the higher VO2 maxes live longer. The ones with lower ones die sooner. Okay, it's pretty important that we look into this further. Is this something we can train? Well, if so, how do we do it? And does that improve lives? So it can be really, really important. You've heard the downsides of this type of research, right? And also because it's big database stuff, it eliminates context and nuance. You have to a lot of times rely on things like recall, right? So, hey, over the last 30 years, what have you been eating? And, that's probably pretty low quality evidence. So it depends on the study specifically. Needless to say, it's incredibly slow. It takes 50 years to build these databases, theoretically. I mean, they do this retroactively, but you get the idea. But the other big thing that people pay attention to is it really conflates risk versus hazard. All right, you need to Google that and look into that, but it's not the same thing, and it can really, really confuse people. So we see these numbers thrown out all the time. This reduces mortality by 35%. Okay, did it reduce your risk of mortality by 35% or your instances of mortality? That's very, very different, right? If your risk was 1%, and it took you from 1% to 1.5%, that's a 50% improvement. But I could say, hey, this improved lifespan by, or reduced risk by 50%. Okay, not really. It took me from 1 to 1.5%. That's not clinically significant. I don't really care about that, right? So you have to look at, there's more to that, but you have to look up risk versus hazard. Two very different things. Okay? The next step down, or the next category, bad example, forgot that. Classic bad examples of epidemiology were the fact that they assume a single factor cause or causality. And this is a classic example of, meat's bad for you. Nope, no it's not. It fails on every other level, which we'll go through. Or if you stop here, right? So if you just take epidemiology and say, hey, there's this correlation, therefore this thing is causing a bad factor, which is again exactly what people did when they tried to claim meat's bad for you. It's just bad science. You're taking one level of evidence, ignoring all the other levels of the evidence, and giving a bad outcome. So you assume the single factor because typically epidemiology puts a human's life. Hey, what have you been doing the last 30 years? And then they tease out one factor. Oh, it's because your hair was blue. What? It didn't have anything to do with my exercise, my this, or my that, or that, or that. And that's not really what affects people's health, for example, is one factor. So it's hard for them to account for or use what we call covariates for multiple factors. So they tend to do one or two or none, and then you get bad science from there. My next category is what I call interventions. So these could be things like as short as 2-week training studies, or up to even like 5-year long. Could be randomized control trials or clinical trials. Could be practitioner data, right? So, hey, I've been coaching these Division I athletes for 5 years. We collect their vertical jump every day, and that's not peer reviewed. It's not the exact. These are not the exact same things, but to me, that's pretty important information as well. So the strength of these intervention studies are they still are science. They have methods and things like that. They can be anyways, and they do start to give you some indications of cause and effect. hey, we did this. This group got this plus that. And here are the different results. So we assume, or we're pretty sure that it's because of this change. So it does give you some indication of cause and effect. And because of that, unlike the first two categories, these interventions can give you specific recommendations. Right? This group got 3 milligrams, this group got 10 milligrams, this group got 100 milligrams. The 3 milligram group did better, therefore we recommend you take 3 milligrams. That's pretty damn helpful. Epidemiology can't really do that, and systematic reviews, depending on what they are, they can or can't do that. And so these things can titrate stuff out. Classic example here was creatine, right? And so when we started doing these intervention studies in the 90s, we started saying, wow, you take creatine for 5 weeks, boy, you get a lot stronger than if you did the exact same workout, ate the same thing, slept the same way, and didn't take creatine. Pretty good evidence that now creatine works. This is why it's, on the very far end of the spectrum in terms of strength of evidence that it does a lot. Downside of interventions, if you've Googled around into this, you realize there's a massive reproducibility issue with these types of studies. There's a massive problem with what we call internal versus external validity, as well as things like, or this would include things like, okay, it was done in a bunch of untrained people. Is that going to be the same thing in my Olympic level sprinters? Okay, yeah, maybe not, probably not, I don't know. And so we have other issues that there's a bunch of stuff that falls under this reproducibility issue. You controlled so many things in the lab, therefore will actually count in the field. Or you didn't control for anything, so how do you know this effect actually mattered? That's internal versus external validity. They also tend to be short-term. So we see these problems of like, okay, yeah, there's no difference between the groups after 8 weeks, but what if you would have continued the 3 years? Now we would have started to see a difference. Well, it's hard to do an actual intervention study for more than a few years without a tremendous amount of funding. And you especially can't do that in athletic or sports science because they're not out of the sport, they're graduated, they're gone. Athletes don't do that. So it gets pretty tough in sports science to do anything longer than a few weeks. And of course, because you're trying to do a 2 week to 8 week to 5 year, it's very, very slow. Not as slow as the meta-analyses, but slow. So a classic example of a misinterpretation here were to use intervention studies for things like this, right? So imagine you did a study or looked at a study on, they compared 8 weeks of linear periodization versus nonlinear periodization and did it in untrained people. Okay, that's helpful, but that's probably not going to tell you a lot because generally periodization is something we're looking at over the course of 6, 8 months, a year. And you didn't untrain people, and so the first 4 to maybe even 10 weeks, the adaptations are probably going to be pretty similar because their training level is so low. And so that's not necessarily, I'm not saying those are bad studies or bad science, but you couldn't use that and say, therefore, there's no difference between these types of training. Well, there may be, but maybe not in this population, and maybe not in this domain. So that would be maybe something you'd have to have. You couldn't take that piece of information and say, okay, look, we're 100 out of 100 here. We know linear is better than nonlinear, or whatever. Okay, this helps, this adds to it, but we're not too certain here. So good examples of places to get information from intervention stuff, the ones we've listed before. But this is also a place where you can go to clinics and conferences and webinars and social media. A lot of people put information out like this. That's very easy to get to. So I would strongly encourage, if you're in this area of sports science, to head to ISSN or NFCA, maybe ACSM, but not really, or a similar event, and go to these national conferences or local clinics or regional ones, and you can learn a lot of information about this level of science, which can be very helpful for you. Continuing to work our way down, now we get into what I call the acute studies. So this could be anything from like a single second. So I give it to them and I immediately measured their blood or whatever, up to maybe like a couple of weeks. This could now also start to include things like animal research. So we did this study in rats, or we did it in cell culture. It could be things like practitioners. Hey, we did this to the person and all of a sudden this is what happened. All important pieces of information there. It still can be science, so that's another con. Now we really, really start to get cause and effect, right? So like, hey, we put this on their hip, they went to the platform, this is what happened. It didn't happen it literally did it immediately. And so this is pretty clear evidence that this is causing that effect, whatever that effect was. And the acute stuff tends to be very good at describing what happened. It doesn't tell you how or why, we'll get to that, but it does tell you what happened. You did this and this is what happened. You took this thing, this is what happened. And because of that, it can provide you pretty specific recommendations. Classic examples are, hey, you took caffeine, all of a sudden your aerobic endurance improved. You took it right now, you went and ran a mile, you ran that mile faster than when you did yesterday when you didn't take the caffeine. Pretty good cause and effect, and we have pretty good confidence that it actually works. Same thing for muscle activation, right? So we looked at when you put your feet open and you did your hip thrust, and then we looked at when you put your feet closed and you did your hip thrust, and when you did it this way, your muscles were activated differently, or whatever, right? It can be very, very acute. When you stand this way, you do this. When you stand that way, you did that. Those are appropriate uses of acute type of information. The downside, we still have reproducibility issues. Major problems with the acute stuff. Internal, external validity is a problem. But the biggest issue with these things are the correlations between acute response and chronic adaptation. Those can be really bad. So for example, just because you took caffeine and ran faster right now, 8 weeks later, will you actually have better endurance when you go to race in your competition? Well, we assume that a lot, and a lot of the times it is true, but it's not necessarily true. And I'll show you some examples in just a second. In fact, let's just do them right now. So the classic example of protein synthesis. So if you take a biopsy out of a muscle and you want to look at the rate of muscle growth, same thing with the signaling aspect of it here. So the molecular stuff is very clearly, just because one thing has a higher rate of protein synthesis than another one, so you compared this supplement to this supplement, A to B. Just because one has a higher rate of protein synthesis, 8 weeks later, you might have the exact same amount of total muscle growth. So they're not unrelated, but it's not linear. So the acute response doesn't necessarily guarantee you the chronic outcome. And this is really rampant in the protein synthesis research or the muscle signaling stuff, the gene expression. So if you have a 5x increase in the gene that makes you grow more muscle, you will not have a 5x increase in muscle growth 10 weeks later. Not even close. And so the acute responses do not predict the actual long-term outcome for a lot of things. Other examples of this are like a fasted versus a fed training study. And so if you did, a study where one day participants came in fed on a bunch of carbohydrates, and then we ran them on the treadmill, and the next day they came in fasted and we ran them on the treadmill. They ran better when they were full of food. Therefore, training with full of food is better for you. Well, that's not necessarily true because you're ignoring the fact that, well, sure, they're hungry today, but actually after 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 weeks or something, they would adapt that. So once they're adapted, now do they actually still run slower? Maybe, maybe not. You don't necessarily know because you're taking a shock to the system, you're comparing that, assuming that they won't ever adapt that. And we know people do adapt really, really, really well. We saw this and this was an appropriate criticism from the keto diet folks, when it was like, hey, we give you a whole bunch of fat and no carbs one day, and you're not used to that, and then we have you do endurance exercise. Well, of course you feel terrible because you're not used to using the fat as fuel. Once your body learns how to do that, you get better at it. And that was partially true. They still sucked and missed a lot of things there, but those criticisms are accurate to this type of acute stuff. So same thing happened with what I'm calling like inflammation folks. So people abuse the acute studies a lot when it comes to things like, oh, this food caused more inflammation, therefore it's worse for you. That's not true at all, right? Not even close, because just since something causes more inflammation, again, it may cause a hormetic response, and you may actually reduce your inflammation because of that, your inflammation. And so the acute response can be used, in fact, this is the type of research that honestly probably is the easiest to manipulate in terms of taking advantage of people. It can be, you don't know the difference or you're trying to do it, but you can use this stuff to make a lot of points. And we have to understand acute versus chronic, right? And so good places for this, the standard science places. But this is where I'll caution you for the conferences, clinics, webinars, and stuff. You really have to understand who you're talking to because, like I just showed you, it's very easy to manipulate the acute science stuff. And this brings me to our next level, which is the mechanism stuff. So these are like 0 to 48-hour studies, animal cell stuff. These are things like, we looked at the blood, or we looked at the cell, or the genes, or anything where you looked at the mechanism of how a cell adapted, right? So this is the real internal biochemistry, biology type of stuff. Pros, very good science, and of course they give you specific recommendations. And now with this cause and effect thing, we started to explain to you how it's working and why it's working. So not just saying when you took this drug, you jumped higher. It's saying you took this drug and jumped higher because this gene got turned on and this is what happened with adrenaline, and your muscle got activated higher because this was released more, etc. So it tells you the mechanism of how things work. And so some examples of some proper interpretations here. This is how we learned that this molecule called mTOR is related to muscle hypertrophy. Great. Therefore, if you turn this thing on, or if this thing gets turned on somehow, you're going to induce some muscle hypertrophy. That's fantastic and very helpful to understand. This is how we figured out maybe stem cells are helpful for injury recovery. When we started injecting stem cells, once we learned what they are and how they work molecularly, we started saying, man, if I put this in somebody's shoulder that's inflamed, maybe they come back from injury, and voila, it started working sometimes. Antibody development. You wouldn't be able to take any kind of pharmaceutical drug without having the molecular mechanism. That's exactly how we figured this stuff out, right? So very appropriate uses of this types of research there. Downside, still have reproducibility problems. It's extremely short term. Right? You think the acute stuff was bad, this is even worse. And we tend to get really exaggerated effects. So I mentioned this a second ago, but this one is one of my biggest pet peeves, and there are people who live and die on the mechanism stuff, and they sound really smart, right? So they'll go on a podcast and they'll ask, like, hey, what do you think about fish oil? And they can give you a 20-minute explanation of, well, it activates this molecule, which activates this one and causes that, and it causes a 40% reduction there. And it's almost all exaggerated, right? As I just mentioned, a 50% improvement in or reduction in inflammation might not have any clinically meaningful result, right? And so it doesn't scale like that perfectly. So you have to be very careful to take advantage and manipulate things like percentages. All right, so you have to understand, well, if I increased C-reactive protein by 13%, does that matter? It turns out it doesn't. You need more like 13,000% improvement to actually see anything happen there. You don't know that. You have no clue, right? And so these people tend to get very excited about the micronutrient stuff or the molecular piece of it when they're taking that stuff very highly out of context and they're exaggerating the effect. Again, it could be intentional or it could not be, right? We have to marry this stuff and match it with the actual outcome, the intervention stuff. So because of that, the validity tends to be questionable, and we have a problem of now what we call reductionism. And so we bring it all the way down to the most microscopic level, we're actually losing the big point. And so you can Google reductionism if you want to learn more about that. Human is another major issue. So here's a couple of very specific examples. I just told you a second ago how one of the major benefits of this mechanism stuff is we learned that mTOR is related to muscle growth. But the major downside was in therefore assuming more mTOR means more growth, and we know that's not true at all. So that's a very poor thing. So we can't, for example, do a study and say, this workout caused a greater release of mTOR, therefore it will cause more growth. Okay, well, let's do the 8-week training study and see who grew more. Oh, it turns out they both grew the same. So it's not that mTOR isn't related, it's just that it's not linear like that. It doesn't work the same way. So that's a really inappropriate use of this type of research. Basically anything under the aging umbrella, this is what they do, right? They take studies from earthworms or at best rodent models and they say, hey, we fasted them or reduced their calories by 13% and they lived 40% longer. Okay, sure. What happened when you did it with humans? No, yeah, though they lived 8 days longer on average. Great. So all of aging research for the most part is based on this molecular stuff, and a huge percentage of it is either extremely exaggerated or not clinically relevant. So it wouldn't actually make a functional difference in humans. We have species compatibility issues. So fasting is another classic example of this. When you looked at it in some of the cell culture stuff in earthworms, it looked amazing in fruit flies. But when it was reproduced in humans, it showed it didn't do anything. And so we know, for example, metabolism does not scale linearly. So things like fasting tend to have huge impacts in small animals, but don't do anything. In fact, have negative impacts in the bigger animals. So we have to be very, very careful whenever we're using mechanism. And again, let me clarify. This doesn't mean those types of studies and cell work is not important. In fact, it's very, very, very good. Look at the blue stuff. That's all coming from cell culture stuff initially, and then animal models. And a lot of the stuff we learn comes from those things. We have to have that stuff. It's very important. Everything has a strength and a weakness, right? Every level here. So good sources here is going to be your classic science stuff for the most part, right? And so you can see all those things we've been through before. Okay, now we're going to start Xing out of the kind of like sciencey stuff and get more towards the other end of the spectrum. And the next one here is teleological. And so you can Google what that really means, but the short version is things like that would fall under this umbrella to me, not necessarily all things just teleological, but just things like, oh, did we evolve for that? Why would it do that? What's the end goal? Does this make sense that biology would actually set it up this way? And so the nice part about it is it tends to win the long game. What I mean by that is ideas that pop up where you're like, okay, it looks like some science is strong here, but this doesn't make any sense teleologically. Give it a few years, the science will probably correct and be like, actually, this doesn't work at all. Fasting is a great one, right? It's also very helpful when science is not available or limited, right? It's kind of like your gut is, why would it do that? Does that make sense that would happen there? There's no science yet, so it actually makes, it sounds like it makes sense. Sounds like this is why a cell would do that. Okay, maybe legit there. And it does correct overzealous science like I just mentioned, right? So it'll help you kind of bring things back to maybe over-exaggerating or just exaggerating, the molecular stuff or the acute stuff, if it doesn't make sense that way. Good examples are things like rotating feeding patterns. It probably does make good teleological sense that we don't eat the exact same meals and have the exact same eating style and have the exact same amount of meals our whole lives. We probably would have never done that as a species. And so it's probably good for us to rotate the types of food we have and the style we eat and maybe do some fasting, maybe don't do, maybe move things around a bit. That probably makes some teleological sense. Things like temperature and sunlight. We probably did get cold at some point. We probably did get hot. We probably were exposed to the sun. So these are probably things, even though the science isn't there yet, this makes some intuitive sense. We should look into doing some science here because, hey, probably important for the cell to get that exposure. Chronobiology is a kind of a new area of saying, hey, well, what about maybe making sure we're going to bed when the sun goes down and waking up when it comes up and kind of matching our biology to the sunlight and things like that, or the time of the day. That stuff makes teleological sense. So science is very limited in all those areas, or at least it was a few years ago, and now it's really starting to come out, but it kind of made sense from the beginning. The cons, science is highly flawed, right? So it's not particularly great there, and it's mostly speculative. And so you can really justify and logic yourself into anything here. Right? This is a classic, well, if you think about it, and then you can enter a whole bunch of logic, and you're like, there's no science here. Okay, and if you're good at making arguments, you can make anything sound appropriate. It gives too much credit to evolution, so it personifies cells, it personifies chemistry, really. Well, it would never, mTOR doesn't want to do anything. mTOR's not a human. It doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have a consciousness. So teleologically, there's problems if you want to, again, Google around teleological biology, and there are some major issues with it. But doesn't mean it's completely useless either. So a couple of examples of on the negative side here are things like carbs are toxic. So for a handful of years, we had to hear about how carbohydrates are what cause all your dementia and aging. Why? That doesn't make any sense. Why would carbohydrates be bad for your brain? Oh yeah, it turns out you're completely full of shit. That's no. Okay, yeah, are there problems with overconsumption? Sure, but it wouldn't make any teleological sense for a carbohydrate to be bad for a human to consume. We saw the same thing when we're like, okay, great. Humans didn't evolve to sit all day, therefore sitting is bad. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I'm following you here. But where they went wrong with that was, therefore, you should stand all day. Like, wait, why? We weren't evolved to stand all day either. Probably standing is, if we're going to compare them, probably better than sitting. But humans evolved to probably move. And so general movement is probably the thing we want to go after, not just sitting or standing, because neither one of them really involves movement. So things like that, right, were mistakes with teleology. Good places here, this is where anthropology helps us a ton, right? And going back to one of the negative things is the problem with anthropology is it changes a lot and it's very limited. I mean, think about it. We're trying to make interpretations of what humans did 30,000 years ago. How much evidence do we really have? And it's probably based on, like 1 or 2 sites. These are classic examples here, like, oh, humans never did this 30,000 years ago. They never ate this. What? Really? Are you sure? Like, how good of a sample size do we have of all humans 30,000 years ago? Or 5,000 years ago, for that matter? And the ones in the Amazon did the same thing as the ones in the Arctic and the ones in the... that doesn't... No. So anthropology is very, very limited. in sample size there, right? Your brain, right? That's the best source for this. And then some books, but I put this in yellow because you got to be careful here. Most authors will try to trick you with teleology and then put some references in there, and it sounds like it's science, but it's really not. All right, and then coming down the end here is what we call natural. And so this could be, again, things like, they're similar to teleology, but it could be like, well, this is natural. Would we have done this? Would we have been evolved to do things like this? Very helpful when science is limited, and like I said, it does correct the overzealous science. And so things that are good here. These are actually all ones that I created. So I remember actually probably being 12 and running in my giant, thick-soled shoes and being like, I don't think this makes me run right. I don't feel very comfortable in this. And so I remember as a teenager being like, man, we shouldn't have these big old thick soles on our shoes. We probably wouldn't have evolved to run like that. It's changing how my feet are running. So I didn't really need a lot of science at that age to be like, because this is not natural, this is probably not optimal. And it turns out we were right about that, right? Screen time, right? I have 2 young kids right now and a toddler. We probably would have not spent 15 hours a day staring at a screen 8 inches from our face, so it's probably smart to have been like, maybe we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't do that with our kids at age 1. Probably correct there. Human connection is another one. Hey, we probably evolved to be around people, so it's generally probably maybe not a great thing for our mental health to be very isolated and living through social media. Another favorite example, I actually put this in the book, my book Unplugged, sanitizer, right? So when we first developed hand sanitizer, it was like, fantastic, sanitize everything. And then it was like, well, wait a minute here. We probably didn't evolve to be completely free of all bacteria. Oh yeah, it turns out we started learning about skin bacteria and how important that is, and maybe we shouldn't be, that's actually funny, I'm doing this part during the corona, but, right? You get it. So the point is, maybe we shouldn't have evolved, or we shouldn't kill off all the bacteria in our mouth and our hands and all the way around us, because we would have never done that before, and we evolved to live with some bacteria. All right. So the cons are, again, it gives too much credit to evolution. Evolution is a thing; it doesn't necessarily have a consciousness. It enables nonsense justifications, and it has the natural fallacy. So you can look into the natural fallacy, but just because something is natural doesn't mean it is actually right or good. And that's the major problem with this level. Along that lines, natural also doesn't mean optimal. So this just because it's how you would naturally do it doesn't mean it's optimal. Example there being teeth. Oh, we never evolved to brush our teeth. Sure, but we also died at 30 when our teeth fell out. So natural has limitations like anything else. And a lot of the other downsides here is it tends to disregard science. And so can people use it and say, oh, we would naturally never done that. I don't care what the science says. And that's a bad take also. So some classic misses on this one were things like bananas. Oh, you shouldn't eat a banana, bro. Why? Because naturally, before humans got involved, they were way smaller. So, who gives a shit? What's that mean? Nothing. Like, there used to be 10 grams of carbs in a banana, now there's 20. Okay, so now you eat half the amount that you used to. You probably would eat 50 of them before, now you eat 2. Who cares? That didn't make any sense at all. The science doesn't support that in any direction. Video games, right? Well, we used to think, oh man, kids would have never played video games, so it's really bad for their health, they need to read a book. And now actually the literature says actually problem solving, follow through, then nothing wrong with video games. Maybe actually some of them are good for your brain development. Hey, if the herbs are better than Big Pharma, why? If it comes from this planet Earth, then it's natural. So just because the product you're having is all natural versus pharmacological, it doesn't make it any better for you or healthier for you, even close. Certainly probably makes it less effective. Some of them are more effective, but it could be less effective. But then the assumption is it's more natural, it comes from natural plants, like the pharmacology stuff didn't come from natural plants at some point also. All right, so some good sources there. Again, anthropology, your brain, just thinking through things, some books, and the hippies. Right? This is where that other end of the spectrum helps us, And again, we mocked them and laughed at them for decades, and this one it's like, well, actually you're probably pretty right in this one. All right. Moving along, then we come to anecdote. And this could be from a scientist, could be from a practitioner. We could look back in maybe the history, see what people have done before. Or one of my favorites, the classic N=1. In other words, your own personal experience. What have you tried? Your self-experiment. My friend Brian McKenzie is doing awesome stuff right now on his platform. Well, depending on when you see this, it could be 5 years from now, I don't know. But he's doing all these N=1 experiments. He's helping people run their own self-experiments through his stuff. So I'd check that stuff out he's doing. But you know the benefits of Anecdote, right? It's very clinically relevant, right? But by definition almost. And it's also very scalable, which is really, really cool and individualized. It's scalable in terms of you can all try it. You can do it a bunch of different times. It's really, really, really fast. You can do as many of these as you want. There's no limitation. You don't have to wait for funding. All this stuff. So it's super awesome that way. My favorite examples there, like I said, this is basically what my entire book Unplugged was all about, is how to do your own self-experiment and how to balance the science and the technology with what your body is actually telling you to figure out what's right for you, not necessarily what's in the meta-analysis. The downside of Anecdote, though, why we actually have science, right, is placebo, right? If you don't control a lot of things, and because you know you're putting yourself through something, almost always, your mind is very strong and good at tricking you that. So you don't really actually know if it worked or not. It has an extraordinarily high error rate because of that. And we have problems with the true for me, so it's probably true for all. So I did this experiment and I lost more weight this way. Therefore, the whole world should do this. That's not how Anecdote works. All you can say is, this is why it worked for me. It worked for me great. Hope it does for you too. And we also have things like spontaneous remission. So a classic example of, instead of taking my cancer drug treatment, I ate only juiced celery, and then my cancer immediately went away. Well, yeah, maybe the juiced celery. Oh, we also have these things in biology called spontaneous remission where things go away and change, and you don't know why. And so you don't necessarily know it's because of that thing you tried from your herbal health store or something. And so we've missed this a lot. Common mistakes with the Anecdote are thinking that the plural of Anecdote equals data, is what we say. So in other words, just because you saw a website and they have 50 pre-post pictures, it's as good as science. It's not, because they probably have 5,000 pre-post pictures that sucked. They're not telling you. Or whatever, right? Or they're not controlling for a lot of things. This is also exactly what leads to fads and trends for the most part. People, oh, I tried this and it worked great. And oh my God, everyone's trying it. Yeah, well, we can explain that actually scientifically. And we know that happens. And then 6 weeks later, they're all back to where they started or worse. Or the next thing pops up, right? Anecdote effect. The other version is the scientists, right? Where this is like, well, if it's not comes from an RCT, it's wrong or we shouldn't do it. And then that's the wrong approach too. We should promote people to do their own self-experiments. Start with science. Science is the foundation, but you got to self-experiment from there. And we shouldn't discourage that just because we don't have a randomized clinical trial to give us the direction to go. So good places to start there. Some books can be really helpful. Social media, clinics, talking to people, working with experts, hiring a coach is probably my strongest recommendation. And then doing your own N=1 experiment. So that being said, we'll go to our second to last category, I think, which is our expert. So these are people or organizations with extensive, what I call high quality experience. And the upside of this is they typically, by definition, they have extreme depth of knowledge and experience. This can't be replicated in any other previous levels. It's fast and extremely precise prescriptions. It's exactly what you need and why, because it's going to look at a lot of categories. They've seen this thing a whole bunch of times. They have a ton of experience doing with it. My classic examples are things like Mike Boyle, right? Mike Boyle is, we'll just say, a very polarizing figure in the strength and conditioning community. He hates basically sports science, but he made some innovations in the field because he did it a lot. He practiced, worked with a lot of people, and he made some really important innovations in our field without doing a single thing, and for pretty much hating science the whole time. But he was an expert and he figured some things out, and that helped. Breath work, I'd say, would be another one. So there was Hindus and shamans and things like that were doing this breath work for a long time, and they were, had spent years meditating, for example, or had trained 100,000 people in this breath work and seen things. And we can learn actually a lot from them and have. And like breathwork is a classic example of something with no science behind it a few years ago. Now the science has really caught up. But these experts really knew what they were doing because they spent a lot of time doing it. Jimmy Radcliffe, another example, legendary speed coach, strength and conditioning coach from the University of Oregon. I don't care if a single one of his methods has ever been supported in a research study. He's one of the most legendary and documented coaches ever at making people fast and strong. Specifically fast and powerful and jumping. So he's an expert. He's done this. He did it, I think, for 25 years at Oregon or something like that. I will trust his depth of knowledge and experience in those realms. Downside, how the hell do you know who's qualified to be an expert? I don't know. Really, really tough, right? Staying in your lane. So I would listen to anything Jimmy Radcliffe ever had to say about speed training. But I don't care. I don't give a crap about what he says about nutrition. Right? Don't care at all. And we see this a ton with things like TV doctors. Like, bro, you have a PhD. Why are you giving us medical advice? You are completely out of your lane. Right? TV MDs are the worst about this. Like, you're a cardiovascular surgeon. Why are you telling me anything about nutrition? You're completely out of your lane. You're using your expertise falsely. It doesn't cross things like that. The classic logical fallacy here is what we call the appeal to authority or tradition. Right? So Jimmy Radcliffe did it, therefore it might be good. That doesn't mean anything. Or Michael Jordan did it, so you should do it this way. That doesn't mean anything. That's a logical fallacy. Right? Other examples, in the earliest stages of the ketogenic diet, or paleo diet for that matter, it was, people talked about it like it's a panacea. It's like, oh, keto's great. Why? It's better for fat loss. It'll cure your cancer. It does blah, 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 blah. And none of that shit was true, right? It wasn't as bad as some of us thought, but it didn't do any of the things that people were talking about for the most part. Even the experts were going on there claiming it did it, but it didn't, right? But scientists did the same thing, right? When those people that loved keto were telling us fat isn't bad for you, and we were like, no, it's bad for you. And the experts and the nutrition experts were saying fat is bad, and then we had to realize, oh, it's not. So both sides have made mistakes here, right? And so you have to be careful with experts. They're not perfect. Functional training was another common one, right? Where you see like Instagram coaches and stuff now doing all this crazy functional training stuff, and you're like, wow, he trains this person, and look what he does. That doesn't matter. It could still be a terrible method, right? And a lot of that stuff was really kooky strength training stuff. Hi, Tatiana. Hey, you want to be on camera? Come here. Here. You want to say hi to everybody?
No.
No? You don't want to say hi to anybody?
No.
They're trying to learn about science and be smarter.
Yeah.
Yeah? Would you rather have lunch than be on camera?
I'm sitting in the chair.
You want to sit in Dad's chair? Okay. Well, you got to go see Mom for a few more minutes.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so our sources. Good places to learn from experts, conferences, clinics, books, podcasts, social media, all that stuff. All right? Just like everything, pros and cons here. And then our last one is what I call your Spyde-Sense, or your Spyde-Sense, and yes, I spelt it wrong intentionally, but this is your intuition, right? Unconscious knowledge is very real, so we should pay attention to your gut, right? And just because you can't justify logically why something is sounding good or bad to you, that doesn't mean we throw it out entirely. It's individualized, right? It's your sense, and it's fast and actionable. Again, I can tell you several examples, not to sound like try to convince you how smart I am or anything, but just these are personal examples for me. Calorie counting, right? When it came to people saying, oh, calories don't count, my Spidey-Sense were like, what? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And then science comes out, and yeah, of course calories count, dummy. Like that didn't make any Spidey-Sense to me at all. Heel squats. I remember being taught to squat on my heels. And I immediately, and ever since, have been like, this doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't sound and feel right at all. I don't think I should squat fully with all my weight on my heels. I should use my whole damn foot. Toe sprints. So I remember also the first time I put on track shoes and I sprinted, and I was like, wow, people tell me to run on my toes, but that doesn't sound right either. I should probably run on this middle part. So static stretching, same thing, right? All these things that they never made any Spidey-Sense to me. My intuition was just like, no, I don't think I should be stretching my hamstring for 30 seconds right before I go run a 100-yard dash. I don't feel fast anymore. I don't feel springy. I feel like I've lost some of my pop. So those didn't make Spidey-Sense to me. The downside of using your intuition is, myself included, is we're all very stupid and convincible. All right, so there's not a lot of your own thoughts going on in your head. Almost everything is coming from the outside. Marketing is very, very real. You can be tricked and convinced into having your own intuition. And typically also because we have incomplete information. So other things that have been silly, again, breathing training. I talked about this a second ago, but that didn't make any sense to me at all. My intuition was like, this is all dumb. And I was definitely wrong about that. Steady state training. I used to hate steady state endurance exercise. Didn't ever made sense to me at all. Now I realize that was a big hole. I should have worked on that more. Machines. I used to hate exercise machines like the bench press machine, dumbbell machine, or squat machines. Those are stupid. Those, no way, intuition was wrong. And they're very, very useful now that I've gotten a little bit older, right? So the good sources of your Spyde-Sense are you, dummy. It's your brain, your intuition, right? So now we've covered all the categories. A little bit of overarching information here about where to get information from. And so this is my list of basically worst places you could ever get things from. Documentaries has to top that list. I don't watch documentaries about anything sports science related, and I haven't for decades. I haven't for probably the mid-90s. They're terrible. They're awful. They're the worst place ever to get information from. Books can be the same, equally bad, but one thing I would recommend is a website called Red Pen Reviews. It's really cool to go to figure out kind of the quality, the accuracy of books. So you can start there. If you're interested in a book, check it out on Red Pen Reviews, and then you can come back and decide to read the book or not. But especially be wary of books from people that have companies or influencers. You know they have a vested interest in what they're selling. Their entire idea is to try to get you. Now, I love when they actually do this and they come at scientists. And they're like, well, hey, that science is invalid because it was funded. That science that showed chocolate milk was good is invalid because it was funded by chocolate milk. Yeah, author who's selling a book. Your whole thing is to try to generate attention to get more things to your book. You are equally have conflict of interest. So just be very careful of people who, again, have a specific company. So if they run a keto company, of course they're going to put out information that shows pro-keto. If they are whatever, like you get the idea. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but you just have to be really weary of that information because they have a major conflict of interest. Similar thing for people whose livelihoods or identities or research agendas, so it could be science as well, are specifically tied to one approach. So we see this a lot with scientists. So they're trying to prove this thing. And of course, all the information they put out is going to be pro that. And they're trying to protect their careers and protect their funding. And it goes both ways. So if anyone's social media handle is Keto Dave or, conjugate system, you get the idea, right? If it's in their social media handles, if it's in their profiles, if it's in their bios, they are admitting to you that they are incredibly biased and it's so tied to their identity, they're probably not going to listen and change with the evidence. So be very careful getting information from those. We call those ideologues, right? Books by MDs, basically throw them out unless it's in their specific MD training. So again, if you're a cardiologist, I don't really care that you write a book on strength training. It's not your expertise. Your MD doesn't matter. Not to mean you're wrong, but your MD has no relevance at all to what you're trying to sell me on. News of any kind, just gone, leave it. Don't watch it, don't read it. It's all out for me at this point. And for the final piece here is people who don't utilize information in their expertise at all. So what I mean by this are, okay, you're a hacker and you're trying to give me the next supplement for cognitive improvement. Do you use it every day? Oh no, you used it 3 days and then wrote this blog. Great, out. Oh, you're a scientist and you want to promote the benefits of training like this. Do you train like that? No. Do you work with people like that? Do you actually coach people? No, you don't. Okay. I'm not saying all this means they're irrelevant, but this is where you have to be very, very careful. If they don't use it themselves or they don't work with people who use it. Again, not saying you're not always possible here, but word of caution. So now what I want to actually do is start going through a bunch of examples. So here's what I've done. I've shown you one of these spider plots or these radar plots. And around the outside of my circle are our 10 categories, right? Meta-analyses, chronic, interventions, acute, etc., etc. So things that are in the very, very middle of the circle means they have a 0 of 10 score. No evidence. Things that are all on the outside of 10. So ideally, we want things as far on the outside as possible. So what I'm going to go through is 3 different concepts, and I'm just using this to show you how the radar plot will work. I'll go through specific examples in a second. But say you had concept number 1 that looked like this. So it had strong meta-analyses data, 8 out of 10 there. Your intuition was really good. You think it really works. Poor scores for chronic evidence. Intervention stuff didn't work, but the acute response looked great. The mechanism looks great. Maybe makes some teleological sense, but you don't really know anybody who's using it. Not a lot of anecdote to it. Experts aren't loving it. How would you interpret this? Obviously, it's not a 95 out of 100. It's not a 5 out of 100 either. So where is it? Well, to me, this is the classic example of something that's probably being overinterpreted. And so what they've done, they looked at the acute response maybe. Oh, there was maybe a molecular response, and then they had some meta-analyses come out on it. We don't actually know if it worked, right? Because there's no chronic studies, there's no intervention studies. You don't actually know if anybody's ever used it. All those categories that involve people using it and seeing an outcome have low scores. So to me, that's probably overinterpreted. That doesn't mean I don't think it works, but I'm not going to use it yet until I've seen some documentation or somebody try it and see some actual effect. Let's take a look at the next one. What about here? Basically, you've seen scores in anecdote, an expert, and nothing else. That's probably not worth my time. Oh, okay, so some people tried it, and some other person who has an expertise in something did it, and they liked it a lot. But we've got no data anywhere else. That doesn't mean I'm going to not do it or say it's wrong or false. But hey, you got a total score of 17 out of 100. You remember where I'm at of that continuum, right? I'm way down the other end of the spectrum. So to me, this is something where I might loosely pay attention to, but I'm probably just going to disregard for now. I'm not going to go against it and post about how it doesn't work, but I'm not paying attention to it really at all. And then, of course, the other one. This is what we're looking for here, right? So concept 3, it's got good scores everywhere else. Maybe there's no acute data to it or something, but it looks pretty solid. I'm probably going to say it works. And honestly, I'm probably not going to pay attention too much more to look for the acute data. Maybe the acute data doesn't make sense here. Maybe it's not necessary. Or maybe those studies were low quality and weren't done right or whatever. But in general, hey, this looks like it's pretty effective. I'm probably going to try it and see. No guarantee. It might not work with me personally, but I'm probably going to try it and see. So let's go through some actual topics and see how these things stack up. So you can learn about the topic, but you can also, again, learn about the system. So the result of this one is actually that we don't need science. So now that I've told you result, what do you think it would look like on the spider plot here? So what categories would be high, what categories would be low for the result to be, I don't care, I didn't need science for this. Maybe something like that, right? So maybe something has perfect scores basically in anecdote, natural, teleology, and your instincts. There's no science whatsoever on it. This might be your parachute example, right? Great, fantastic. I'm doing this 100 times out of 100, and I don't need a single score in science to tell me that if I jump out of a plane, I'm going to die without a parachute. So I didn't need science there. Another example that might not need science may look like this. So maybe it doesn't make any natural sense, no teleological sense, a little bit of intervention and chronic data, but no acute, no mechanism. And this may be something like a coaching example. So hey, we know that the conjugate system works for getting people strong. Why? Look at what they've done. They've got 30 years of extreme success. They don't have any meta-analyses, and there's a little bit of like chronic stuff and intervention stuff on some other parts of the system, but I don't care what the biology says, and it doesn't matter that it doesn't make any, well, we didn't evolve to lift with bands. Who cares? The anecdote and the expert and the instincts are really high. I probably don't need science on that one. Here's another one, and your end result is science can help you, but you need to experiment from yourself. What would that look like on your spider plot? Science can help you get started here, but you need to experiment. Maybe something like that, right? Again, a lot of anecdote experience or experiment or experts like it. Maybe it makes a ton of, it should work that way. And there's some acute and intervention stuff there, but we haven't seen the chronic data come out yet. We haven't seen the long-term data. And then maybe something like this. You want to know which type of lift works your quads more, your personal quads, front squats or lunges. Well, the science can't really tell you that because your biology is unique to you. And so the science can give you like best practices. And maybe a coach and expert will say, no, definitely, I've been doing this for 25 years, personal training people. And generally, hey, the front squat is a lot better for quad activation than lunges. There's no necessarily chronic 35-year training studies on that. Nobody knows or cares or won't be. There's no molecular mechanism. Nobody knows or cares. Doesn't make any natural sense. Who cares? So the science can get you started, though, probably. You can say, hey, look, the research done so far on muscle activation does show that the front squat is typically more here. Okay, great, so we'll start there. But me personally, depending on my leverage and my lunging style, I may have a different result from the science. So the science can help you get started, but you'll need the experiment on yourself from there. Next result here, science is all you really need and most likely works. Now, I've already actually covered this one. Here's your spider plot. And maybe it's something like, what do I take for an infection? Right? Again, it doesn't need to make natural sense. You don't have to have an instinct. Hopefully the experts are high on it, saying, yeah, we've used this a lot and it works. But I don't really need the practical side of this. This is just basically a science question. What's the science say? Let's do it. Okay, now the inverse here. Now I'll start with the spider plot and you tell me what you think the example is. Right? So maybe you find some experts that are really high on this. Meta-analyses, chronic intervention stuff is really low. And maybe there's a little bit of mechanism, but it makes no teleological sense, makes no anecdotal sense, goes against your instincts. It doesn't make any natural sense. This is the spider plot for me for the saying that meat is bad for your health. And for the expert, I only put that at 10, assuming you found an expert who's really against meat. Say they're an MD and they're really against meat and they sound really convincing. It's not actually, most experts in the field don't agree with that, so I don't want to get that false impression. But that's what it might look like, right? And so this is why this argument that meat is bad for your health is so poor and it fails so massively. You might be able to cherry pick a study or two from one of these areas, but if you look at the whole base of evidence, it fails on almost every level. You might be able to pick up some of the mechanistic stuff and say, hey, when you consume meat, it does this to inflammation, or it has these carcinogens in it. Sure, but when we look at the acute, intervention, chronic, meta-analyses, it doesn't make any natural sense, doesn't make teleological sense. We don't see people who are eating meat and dying all over the place. It really, really fails as an argument, right? So I'm not saying at all that vegan is bad or vegetarian is bad, not even close. But the assertion alone that meat is bad for your health, it just fails. It's a really bad argument, and it's unfair to represent it that way. If you want to make you shouldn't eat meat for other rationale, fine, you could totally do that. But for this argument, it doesn't really shake. So it's extremely unlikely, and basically it's close to false as we can possibly get. Okay, another one here, highly exaggerated animal or cell results and unlikely to be very important to humans. It would look something like that. Again, I've kind of talked about this example of exaggerating the molecular stuff and getting really excited about that piece, despite the fact that it's not showing in the other areas. And this would be intermittent fasting for longevity, right? It just doesn't shake out. You can get really excited about the molecular and earthworm studies, but every other aspect, it doesn't really fly. Besides maybe natural. Probably naturally we would go periods of eating and not. Okay, sure. Yeah, I buy that. But everything else, it's not really looking like it's shaping up to be very strong. Okay, another one. I put this in the list before, but this is even worse, right? So grossly exaggerated animal cell stuff, unimportant humans, and even possibly dangerous. So this is a classic example of something that was taken straight from the molecular mechanism, massively misapplied, and in fact actually hurt people. That was metformin, right? So there was a lot of people who were like, wow, let's just start taking metformin in our 40s to protect us against aging because of over-exaggerated or just, exaggerated, molecular stuff. In fact, just misinterpreted molecular stuff. Despite no evidence anywhere else in the platform, and despite the fact that the logic behind it was really poor, people pushed it, and these are aging experts, and oh great, this person's so innovative, and they're forward. Right, until the clinical trials started coming out showing this is crippling people's muscle mass. Oops. Yeah. If you would have looked at the whole evidence base, you'd have been like, no, this is not very convincing at all. I'm not saying you should never do it, but those people should have been like, look, I'm doing this. There is not good evidence for it across the board, but this is what I'm doing. And then when that stuff came out, they should have been retracting and apologizing. Anyways. Here's an example of something that's maybe got my attention, and I'm like, I think maybe there's something here yet, but we need more evidence. And maybe it looks something like that. So my instincts are really high on it, Maybe, yeah, people are trying it and there's some good anecdote. Maybe I tried it and liked it, and the experts are back and forth on it. Makes a lot of teleological sense. Mechanisms are there. And this is stem cells, right? If you look at the meta-analyses in chronic and intervention stuff right now, it's really 50-50 or less. But because of how it's working in the other stuff, I really think there is something there to using stem cells for injury, but not here. We're missing something big time. We haven't figured out how to use it or how to manipulate it exactly, but I think something is here. But there. So, classic example of I really do think science will be there, but my confidence isn't high because the evidence isn't strong yet. So I think the future is strong for it, but currently it's kind of a guess. It's like 50-50 right now. May work, may not. And then we have something that would be more classically mostly wrong. And you can see this is being clearly driven by anecdote, which is not fine. Anecdote's fine as long as it's supported by everything else. But this was classic paleo, right? Paleo, because our ancestors didn't eat paleo or didn't eat carbs until the science on that changed and we realized, yeah, they did. Also, that doesn't make natural sense. And there was just all kinds of logical problems with that. Gluten being bad. Well, gluten's bad if you don't tolerate it well. But for those that do, it's just fine. Right, so there was all kinds of holes in that logic. Mostly wrong, but very little total evidence. That's keto, 8 years ago. Right, so we had a lot of anecdote coming out. It actually does make some teleological and natural sense that we should maybe do some periods of being a high-fat, low-carbohydrate. You could make that argument there, but there was no science. There's no data there, right? But here's the cool thing about keto. Look at the keto now. It turns out they actually got a lot right. They got a lot more wrong. Like, again, keto doesn't stop you from getting cancer or any other nonsense claims. But there is merit there. And so look at the spider plot was kind of crappy there, but look, it's moved. There is a lot of scientific support now. The meta-analyses are getting there. The chronic stuff is coming along. Interventions are showing good stuff. The acute stuff, no, but that's the opposite of what you go for keto, right? The mechanisms are coming along, and it does make some decent sense. So I would say that this is a great example of I shouldn't have been so negative to keto when it first came out, but I have changed my tune because more evidence has come along. I still don't think it's a great diet for most performance athletes. It's oftentimes bad, but I actually have changed, and now I think it's reasonable for non-active sedentary people. It's probably fine if it works better for you. It's definitely fine if it works better for you, right? So the keto folks got a lot of things wrong, but they did have some things right that we missed on, right? So hopefully you enjoyed that and you helped, and I want to finish on a little story. And this is a story about the dragon in my garage. And I don't actually have a dragon in my garage. I borrowed this from two folks. I borrowed this from Carl Sagan in his famous book, Demon Hunter World. And Carl's dragon in the garage goes like this. He says, hey, look, I want you to come into my garage. I want you to see my dragon in my garage. And you go in the garage and you don't see a dragon. You're like, what the hell, where's the dragon? And you go, oh, no, sorry. It's an invisible dragon. And you go, oh, okay, it's invisible. Great. Well, why don't we just put a bunch of flour on the ground so when it walks around, we'll see the footprints. And you go, oh, no, I forgot to mention. Not only is it also invisible, but it only flies. It only hovers. It doesn't actually touch anything. Oh, okay, no problem. Well, I have a radar detector. Why don't we just actually put a radar detector and we'll see him on infrared? Oh, no, actually it's a special dragon who actually blocks out any heat and shoots only cold or non-temperature based flames, so there's no heat there. Oh, okay, great, fantastic. Well, then why don't we just spray some paint on him and then that'll stick to him? Oh, no, paint doesn't stick to his coat. He's got a special coat of armor. You get the idea here, right? And so when we're trying to identify basic nonsense, so when people are lying, whether there's actually a real dragon, because at some point the argument would be, okay, well, if there's an invisible dragon who doesn't put off any heat, doesn't touch the ground, and has skin that doesn't allow paint to stick to it, what's the difference between that and actually there being no dragon at all? Pretty tough to say. And so your evidence has to be falsifiable at some point. And so we have to be very careful when people use this tactic of what we call moving the goalpost, right? And or making a position completely unfalsifiable. So that has to be there. So what I want to give you is this last little piece. And this is actually my father-in-law, Dave Beck, and I actually had the pleasure of having him on our podcast a few years ago. So you can check out the episode 2.6 if you want. But this is actually him on the cover of New York Times. So he's a middle school science teacher. And he did the entire curriculum of their class and did it based on the movie Mars, which was really badass, and so they put him on the cover of New York Times. But nonetheless, he teaches this exact lesson to his students. This is his BS detector, if you will. This is my bullshit detector. He teaches 8th graders, you're adults. But nonetheless, he teaches them 8 points. And so when you're trying to identify the quality of evidence, you have to look, number one, is it coming from multiple sources? In science, this is why it's important that we make sure it's coming from multiple labs. If you see things, you're like, wow, there's really convincing evidence on something. There's 10 papers on it, but 9 are from the same lab, the same author. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but I'm more convinced when I see 10 studies from 10 different labs, all showing the same thing. Then it's very likely to be true. You have to differentiate between an expert and an authority. An expert is someone who knows something, and an authority is someone who's popular. We've already been through this a bunch of times in this video, right? Lots of authorities, MDs, things like that on TV, doesn't mean they have expertise in that area. Try to get measurements, so try to quantify. So make sure that something you can do is measurable and you can actually test and determine whether or not the effect is true. Occam's razor. So the simplest explanation is probably the more accurate one, rather than the opposite. Especially if there's multiple reasons that could explain something, start with the simpler one. Are there other plausible explanations? So what else could be causing this rather than what the thing the person told you was? That could be the entire thing, it could not be. Is it mostly true? So if someone's telling you an argument and it requires 3 pieces of things to be true, if 2 of them are true but one's not, the argument doesn't stand. So it can't be mostly true. It has to be totally true or it's not true. We've already talked about, is it generally falsifiable? And then ego. So are people protecting and sticking to their explanations just because it's theirs? Or are they willing to change when the evidence changes? So hopefully those 8 tips, I think, were helpful to you. So some final reminders as we wind down. It's hard to be right, and you shouldn't really expect people to be. You just have to have the right process and be genuine and honest with people. Don't misinterpret the data or the scientific evidence, and be accountable when you're wrong. Most importantly, though, to all this stuff, just be nice. So hopefully this helped you get through some of the BS that's out there. If it did, you can, again, thank me. I did this during Corona, and so don't mind my physical appearance. It shouldn't have anything to do with the quality of my video. You know what to do if you appreciated this. You know, these things take me hours and hours and hours to do, especially right now when I don't have the time. And it's not exactly something you would do to draw a whole bunch of attention on social media, is to make a 2-hour video about BS detection. So if you enjoy it, help me share and do all that other stuff, but that's the only ask I have for you. If you found this valuable and you actually apply this to something, you learn something, I would love to hear about it. So shoot me an email, make a comment or whatever to be like, hey, I used this, I thought about this better, and I totally changed my position on this. Or affirmed it. Either way, that's totally awesome. Just let me know. If not, peace out, one love.